Hello lovelies, in this video we're going to be going through your AQA GCSE Sociology paper 2, the paper that we've written for 2024. So what I want you to pay attention to is how we've structured things, the balance of AO1, AO2 in our answers, and how we link in all of our paragraphs together.
Welcome to the GCSE Sociology AQA 2024 Predicted Paper 2, covering topics the sociology of crime and deviance and social stratification. You have 1 hour and 45 minutes allowed to complete all questions on the paper in the exam, and you have no options or choices of questions or topics, so you must complete them all. All questions should be answered in continuous prose, obviously except for multiple choice questions where you should just select one answer. The total amount of marks for this paper is 100, which means you should allocate 1 minute per mark. Now this walkthrough will take you through the predicted paper questions for 2024. We will also think about the mark schemes and what the examiners are looking for each question, breaking down the AO1, AO2 and AO3 skills. And then we will have a look at some model answers. So let's get going. Identify the term commonly used by sociologists to describe the monitoring of behaviour, activities or information by institutions such as the government. Fill one circle only, 1 mark. A. Surveillance. B. Probation. C. Deterrent. Or D. ASBO. So a reminder on these multiple choice questions, you circle only one. If you circle more than one, then the answer will be void, regardless of whether one of the ones you have circled is correct. And quite often there will be some similar concepts or terms in there, so you really do need to make sure that you reread the question carefully, but quickly, and that you select the correct answer. And with regards to the content within this question, a common mistake that students often make on the crime paper is to fail to distinguish the difference between the monitoring of behaviour and the punishment of behaviour. And within this specific question, that would absolutely cost you your mark. So if we work from the bottom up, D refers to ASBO, an antisocial behaviour order, which obviously is not a way to monitor behaviour because this is a specific punishment. And these can be handed to anyone over the age of 10 for causing alarm or distress to people who are not in their same household. It may be that that person has persistently been engaging in antisocial behaviour. And these specifically have received a lot of attention within the media over the last 20 years, where there has been a real stereotypical view that they are applied to working class boys in gangs. For the purpose of this question, though, clearly is not a way the government is monitoring behaviour or activities. So if we have a look at C, you've got the key term deterrent, which is something that prevents people from doing something by essentially making them afraid of the consequences if they do. So for example, if a judge starts handing down very hefty prison sentences for something like a drug offence, that may then put off people from committing drug offences because they are worried about receiving the same sort of punishment. Again, though, for the purpose of this question, not a way that the government monitors behaviour. So let's have a look at probation. So this term really refers to a period of supervision over an offender. So for example, once an offender has been released from prison, they may be placed under probation, where they have to check in with their probation officer to make sure that they are not re-offending. Or it may be that someone receives a probation order as a consequence or as a punishment as opposed to a prison sentence. So again, for the purpose of this question, not a way that the government monitors our behaviour or activities. So therefore, the correct answer must be A, surveillance. So surveillance in the form of CCTV, for example, basically means that the government or police are monitoring our behaviour for the purposes of crime control. It may be that that surveillance actually does act as a deterrent itself, because if we know we are being watched, we might be less likely to commit a crime. And just a couple of statistics to support the idea that surveillance is just becoming a part of everyday life in the UK and therefore a significant feature within the crime topic. It's estimated that there is one CCTV camera for every 11 people in the UK now, and that we are actually captured on UK CCTV up to 70 times per day. Identify the term commonly used by sociologists to describe practices and policies within an organised setting that unfairly disadvantage people based on their ethnicity. Fill one circle only, 1 mark. A. Self-fulfilling prophecy. B. White-collar crime. C. Zero tolerance policing. Or D. Institutional racism. So we should only be spending around about 1 or 2 minutes on this question in the exam, and we just need to make sure that we really reread that last bit of the question, as there are often several options that could be correct. And as always, we will fill only 1 circle in the exam. If we fill in more than 1 circle, even if one's correct, then the examiner will just have to void that answer. So if we work through the key concepts that we've got here to try and figure out which one may relate to this idea of an organised setting that unfairly disadvantages people based on their ethnicity. A, we've got self-fulfilling prophecy. And this is certainly a key concept that we should be very familiar with, particularly linked to labelling theorists and interactionists who basically argue that once someone is labelled as a specific type of person, whether that is negative or positive, that label can be internalised by the individual, and then that can lead to a self-fulfilling prophecy, i.e. the way that that person has been labelled starts to actually become true. We act in the way that we are told we should act, or we act in the way that we have been defined by others. Clearly, though, that does not relate to this question, so we'll move on to B. B, white-collar crime. Again, this answer does not answer the question. White-collar crime is a term that we do use within the crime topic, but it refers specifically to non-violent middle-class crime that often takes place for financial gain. So examples of white-collar crime might be something like fraud or tax evasion. Moving on to C, zero tolerance policing. And this relates to a strategy often associated with right-wing politicians whereby the police come down really heavy-handed on low-level crime. So things like graffiti or antisocial behaviour have quite severe punishments. Again, clearly not the definition we are looking for here. So it must be institutional racism, which refers to policies or practices that exist in a discriminatory fashion for a specific ethnic group, potentially an ethnic minority. And in the case of this question, that is taking place within an official organisation such as the police. Within our crime topic, we often refer to the Macpherson report, which in 1999 concluded that there was institutional racism within the Metropolitan Police, and this was a consequence of an inquiry into the murder of Stephen Lawrence. So since 1999, there have been many policies put in place to try to address the fact that some ethnic minorities are unfairly disadvantaged. Describe one example of a corporate crime. 3 marks. So you are going to allow yourself around about 3 minutes to complete this question, and you will achieve 3 AO1 marks. So the examiner is looking for a full description showing accurate knowledge of an example of corporate crime. You can use theories, key concepts, and in some of these questions, research methods may be applicable. So what do we mean by the term corporate crime in sociology? Well, it's one of those key concepts that comes up within the Marxist and power part of the crime course, and therefore it refers to a type of white-collar crime, i.e. this is being carried out by high-status individuals in society. The main difference between a traditional white-collar crime and a corporate crime is that a corporate crime is likely to take place through a very large organisation, where white-collar crime might take place more through individuals or small groups. And very similar to white-collar crime, corporate crime will not involve that sort of street-level crime of violence. It is all about material wealth. And quite often people don't always recognise that corporate crimes are crimes. They tend to be quite well hidden in society. Examples might be fraud or tax evasion. And they're another really great example of why official crime statistics do not show us the full extent of crime in society. Because of the nature of these types of crime, they are less likely to be punished within the law system, and people who are affected by corporate crime are less likely to view themselves as victims. Really good idea to go into the exam knowing a few examples of the types of corporate crime that can take place, and if possible, some contemporary examples to support that as well. Let's have a look at a 3 out of 3 answer. Describe one example of a corporate crime. 3 marks. One example of a corporate crime includes committing environmental offences, such as polluting the air or water with harmful materials. These crimes take place by large organisations and powerful companies, and often go unpunished due to the complex nature of them. So you can see in our first sentence, we achieve our first AO1 mark by identifying a specific example. And you always want to start these 3 markers with the example. Highlight it, signpost it to the examiner with that phrase, one example of. Here we've gone with the view of polluting the air or water with harmful materials. We could have also gone with the sale of goods that are knowingly unsafe or unfit for use. Or we could have gone for labour law offences, i.e. not paying the minimum wage or not following health and safety guidelines for staff. We then just support that with one sentence to explain in a bit more detail how and why corporate crime takes place, identifying the type of groups in society that are accused of corporate crimes, i.e. the powerful, which is why this fits in so brilliantly with the Marxist topic within this course. And then we also discuss the fact that they go unpunished because they are complex and they are often seen as victimless. And if you did want a specific contemporary example of a corporate crime, you could use the 2017 Volkswagen emissions scandal, whereby Volkswagen were punished and ordered to pay £2.8 billion for rigging diesel-powered vehicles to cheat on government emissions tests, i.e. polluting the air with harmful materials knowingly. That's also a really great example to use because it does show how a corporate crime was actually punished. Identify and describe one function of crime for society. 3 marks. So you should only be allocating around about 3 minutes to answer this question, and you have 3 AO1 marks available. That means the examiner is looking for a full description which shows largely accurate sociological knowledge. And we do that through the use of theories, key terminology and concepts, examples, and in some cases research methods may also be appropriate. For this specific question, I have a top tip for you. If you ever see the term function in any exam question in sociology, it means that you need to apply some sociological theory. So, most obviously, that might be functionalism, or you could also include Marxism or feminism. And that means you might be applying a positive function of crime if you go for functionalism, or a negative function of crime if you go for Marxism or feminism. Personally, I would argue if there's a question that does mention function, functionalism is going to be the easiest one to apply because you can take that general rose-tinted view that this is performing a positive role for society. And there is absolutely no need to evaluate any theory that you include because there are no AO3 marks awarded for this question. So when it comes to functionalism and the functions of crime for society, there's absolutely loads of explanation that we can provide. Primarily that will come from Durkheim, one of the founding fathers of sociology, who had an awful lot to say about crime. So you might mention terminology such as social solidarity and the fact that when a crime is committed, we come together as a society, condemn the person who's committed the crime and feel a sense of belonging. You might be using terms such as boundary maintenance, i.e. when people commit crimes and receive punishments, it reminds the rest of us that there are boundaries in society that we should not cross. Or you could take a more negative Marxist approach and argue that crime only performs functions to benefit the ruling class in society, i.e. it helps to maintain their status quo. And that may be through things like property law that help to protect their wealth, or it might be through the working class receiving harsh punishments. So let's have a look how much we'd need to include to get 3 out of 3. Identify and describe one function of crime for society, 3 marks. One function of crime for society, as argued by Durkheim, is to promote feelings of social solidarity. He argues that when people come together in shock and condemn a crime, they feel a sense of togetherness, promoting social harmony. So here we are using that lovely rose-tinted idea from Durkheim and functionalists that even crime has a positive effect on society. Durkheim actually argued that crime is inevitable, it's found in all societies, so it is universal, and that actually, as long as there is not too much crime or too little crime, it performs loads of great functions for a healthy society. Here we are using that idea of social solidarity. So when people come together and feel like they belong as part of a community rather than feeling like an individual. So an example might be if there is a particularly shocking crime reported within the media, perhaps a murder, people come together to discuss it and to feel a sense of shock together. And as a consequence, it reinforces a feeling of community and togetherness. And all of this, according to Durkheim, is essential in promoting a value consensus, or what we use in the example here, a social harmony. And with regard to the structure of this answer, we really easily get our 1 out of 3 by identifying that term social solidarity as the function. And then we get our 2 extra marks by just adding a bit more explanation of how that works. And although we don't need to criticise Durkheim to get our 3 out of 3 in this answer, if we did want to critique this view in other questions, sociologists are highly critical of this view of crime being so positive for society because it ignores the feelings of victims. And finally, it's also really difficult to measure the extent of crime that is needed in order for society to be harmonious. So how do we know how much crime is too much crime, or how do we know how much crime is too little crime? Item A. Crime statistics in London suggest that there is a significant relationship between the number of reported crimes and the most materially deprived areas. For example, 52% of all crimes reported in London took place in the poorest areas in 2022. Violence, robbery and sexual offences were twice as likely to be recorded in the poorest 10% of areas compared to the richest 10%. All data is based upon police recorded crime in London, which measures offences that are reported to and then also recorded by the police. Source: www.trustforlondon.org.uk. From item A, examine one weakness of the research. So it is very common within the crime paper to be handed some crime statistics that you need to interpret. And for this question, we need to figure out what is a weakness of using statistics in this way to consider crime. And although it is really important that you do read the item very carefully if you are given some official statistics in the exam, there are some very common responses that we can use as either an advantage or a weakness if we are using statistics in this way. Particularly when those statistics are trying to measure the extent of crime in society. So, for example, crime statistics never actually measure or reveal the true extent of crime. And this is because of what sociologists refer to as the dark figure of crime. So that refers to anyone who is a victim of crime but decides not to report it, including those crimes that are reported to the police but the police decide not to act upon, or people who commit a crime and don't get caught. So it's always a really good analogy to think of crime in society or crime statistics as a bit of an iceberg. We see the tip of that iceberg through crime statistics. There are loads and loads of unreported crimes that are going on beneath the waves. And then we have our more general other criticisms of using official statistics in sociology. So interpretivists would argue that we are never gaining access to true meaning or complex explanations when we look at numbers. For this specific item, though, we are only considering crime statistics in London. So we might also want to include the fact that this will not be representative for the whole of the UK. London is the capital city, and it has its own characteristics, its own demographic features, and therefore we can't really take this data and apply it to a rural village in Yorkshire. And with regard to the marks allocation for this question, you can achieve 1 AO3 mark for identifying the weakness of the research and 1 further AO3 mark for adding some explanation as to why this is a weakness. Let's have a look at an answer. From item A, examine one weakness of the research, 2 marks. One weakness is that interpretativists argue crime statistics are socially constructed. This means they do not reflect the true extent or provide a valid picture of crime in society due to crimes that go unreported, referred to as the dark figure of crime. So here we use the term socially constructed to criticise crime statistics. However, that is a term that you can use on any exam paper when you are criticising any official data that you are given. And this basically refers to the idea that actually no one behaviour in society is inherently criminal. But as interpretivists and labelling theorists such as Becker argue, a criminal act only becomes a criminal act once it is labelled by those in power within a specific context. And when it comes to crime statistics, there are several different people who are involved in whether that act becomes criminal. So the victim themselves might need to report the crime. The police need to decide whether they are going to record the crime. The criminal prosecution service need to decide whether they are going to proceed with that police report. And then ultimately, a jury and a judge or a magistrate decides whether that person is innocent or guilty and whether they should receive a custodial sentence. So there are lots of different people who are involved at every single stage of whether that crime statistic really does become a crime statistic. And this is why interpretivists argue that we cannot trust crime statistics to give us a valid understanding of the extent of crime in society. We also use at the end there that key sociological term, the dark figure of crime, which you may also see referred to as the hidden figure of crime, i.e. all those crimes that go unreported or unrecorded. And with regards to the structure of this answer, we gain 1 mark for stating that crime statistics are socially constructed as a weakness, and another mark for saying that this does not therefore reflect the true extent of crime in society. Obviously, we could get this same question in the exam asking us to apply a strength of the research, and this is where we would argue a positivist perspective that crime statistics are a really fantastic way to be able to compare and contrast trends within crime over time. Perhaps we can break those statistics down into demographic groups such as gender or social class or ethnicity. Identify and explain one reason material deprivation and criminal offences may be linked as shown in item A, 4 marks. So with regards to this answer, you will be spending around about 4 to 5 minutes identifying first of all a reason material deprivation may be linked to higher criminal rates, and then explaining that in more detail. And you can achieve 1 AO1 mark, that is with the suitable reason that you give, and 3 AO2 marks, that is with regards to how you apply that reason and add extra sociological explanation, examples and key concepts. Just to remind you of some of the key findings within item A, 52% of all crimes reported in London took place in the poorest areas. And specific types of crime such as violence, robbery and sexual offences were twice as likely to be recorded in the poorest 10% of areas. So we can conclude that if you are living in a poorer area, an area that suffers from material deprivation, then you are more likely to be a victim of crime, you are more likely to take part in a crime, and those crimes are more likely to be violence, robbery and sexual offences. So in order to get the best marks on this question, we obviously need to understand this term material deprivation, which refers to individuals in society having an inability to be able to afford resources that may be basic or may leave them feeling relatively deprived to those around them. So for example, material deprivation could include not being able to afford appropriate housing, but within some societies like the UK and the USA, that could actually refer to someone not being able to afford a mobile phone. And this question is asking us how this material deprivation, this feeling of not having enough material possessions, may lead someone to go out and commit a crime. So with that in mind, it is likely that most of the ideas here we could use for the exam are going to come from functionalist theory, and particularly Merton's strain theory of deviance, i.e. that crime is a consequence of individuals experiencing a strain between the goals that they want to achieve, this idea of an American dream, and the lack of opportunities that they have in society to be able to achieve those goals. If you are less confident, however, with Merton's strain theory, you could apply Marxism here, and the idea that within a capitalist society, values of materialism are constantly promoted through the media and advertising, which means that some people feel a sense of material deprivation that causes them to go out and commit criminal offences, as they will never be able to afford the products that they are being told they need. And whichever theory you decide to apply here, we do not need to add any evaluation because we can only achieve AO1 and AO2 marks here. So let's have a look at a top band answer. Identify and explain one reason material deprivation and criminal offences may be linked as shown in item A, 4 marks. As shown in item A, crime is often higher in lower income areas. This may be linked to ideas within Merton's strain theory. This occurs when working class individuals in society strive to achieve the same goals, which Merton identifies as the American dream, as the middle class, such as a big house, nice car and holidays. However, due to the limited opportunities the working class have to achieve these goals, they experience anomie and are forced to turn to crime instead. So what you've got in this answer is clear link to item A, i.e. we identify that crime is higher in lower income areas, and then a really nice, simple and straightforward explanation of how this might be linked to Merton's strain theory. And I really do think Merton's strain theory is one of the best studies in this crime topic to know in lots of detail, as you can apply it to so many explanations of why crime occurs. It's also one of your key studies, so you should be really familiar with the fact that he's writing from a functionalist perspective and the fact that he does provide this fairly comprehensive view of why, particularly in America, working class people are more likely to commit crime. And we don't need to apply criticism of Merton's theory within this question, but if we did need to on another question, then we would argue that Merton is being overly deterministic in his view of the working class. And by this we mean he assumes that all members of the working class are striving to achieve the American dream, this view of having a picket fence and a big house, which simply isn't the case. The working class are not one homogenous group, i.e. they are not all the same, and we are all complete individuals. We could also argue that Merton only focuses on specific types of crime in society, particularly utilitarian crime, which refers to crime committed for material gain. So we cannot use Merton's theory, for example, to understand why violent crime might be being committed in these working class areas, as is identified within item A. Overall, though, if we do get a question about material deprivation and criminal offences, Merton's strain theory is definitely the best example to use. Identify and explain one advantage of using unstructured interviews to investigate the effectiveness of community sentencing as a form of punishment, 4 marks. So we are only going to spend around about 4 to 5 minutes answering this question, and we need to ensure we understand how to structure these questions that ask us to consider a research method in a specific context. So you can achieve 1 AO1 mark for providing a suitable advantage of using unstructured interviews, and that can be quite general research methods knowledge. But then you will receive 3 marks for giving an explanation of why this is an advantage using theoretical knowledge or key concepts or examples. And of course, for these types of questions, you should also, to get the 4 out of 4, put that into the specific context given, which for this question is the effectiveness of community sentencing. So to just explore both elements of the question then, unstructured interviews are associated with interpretivist methods in sociology, and they really are about ensuring the interviewee has opportunity to be able to explain their answers in as much detail as possible. So sometimes these interviews can last for several hours. It also means the interviewer has opportunity to probe the interviewee at any opportunity where they feel they may be going off in an interesting direction, which obviously means you need a very skilled sociological interviewer to complete these interviews. With regards to community sentencing, we are referring to punishments whereby offenders have to carry out some sort of activity within the community. So, for example, that might include hours of unpaid work, like removing graffiti, or it might mean having to abide by a particular curfew, i.e. not being able to go out after a certain time. So we need to try and apply some of the general advantages of unstructured interviews, such as that high validity, the ability to build up a report or probe to this specific context. Let's have a look at a 4 out of 4 answer. Identify and explain one advantage of using unstructured interviews to investigate the effectiveness of community sentencing as a form of punishment. 4 marks. One advantage of using unstructured interviews is that the researcher is able to build a sense of rapport with the respondents. This is because the interview may take place over several hours and the format is conversational and not formally structured. This might mean that it is more likely for people who have experienced community sentencing to open up about what could be a very difficult and emotive experience as they feel more comfortable and lead to valid results. So you can see within the very first sentence we achieve our AO1 mark by showing the examiner we are identifying a strength of these type of interviews, and that is the sense of rapport that the interviewer can build with the respondents. And this is because the interviewer and the interviewee have so much contact with each other when it comes to unstructured interviews. They may spend several hours together talking through a very specific and, in this case, personal issue. And because of that, they may build a very positive relationship. And an interpretivist would argue that when we build those positive relationships, we are much more likely to tell the truth, and therefore respondents are giving rich, detailed, but most importantly, valid answers to questions. Now you can see in the structure of this answer, once we have identified our advantage, we explain in a little more detail why that is an advantage to pick up some AO2 marks. And then that last sentence means we are placing this in the context of community sentencing. So we have already talked about community sentencing being a type of punishment that people receive. It may be that you have to go out on the streets and clean graffiti or do litter collecting, and therefore it is going to be something that people find in some circumstances quite difficult to talk about. So therefore, if we just handed someone a questionnaire in a detached way, it may be that that person puts that questionnaire down to one side, never looks at it again, and tries to forget about the sociological research. But in using an unstructured interview, it really does give the opportunity for this person who has experienced community sentencing to give their opinion on it. And because community sentencing only applies to such a small percentage of the population, it would also be quite a tricky topic for sociologists to think of a range of questions for. But through using unstructured interviews, if the respondent gives a really interesting answer that the interviewer wasn't expecting, they are able to go off on a tangent and explain that in more detail. The interviewer has the room to be able to probe, which is another really great advantage when it comes to this specific research method within this specific context. And if we were going to consider a disadvantage of using unstructured interviews to investigate the effectiveness of community sentencing, then we would apply some positivist arguments, i.e. the fact that the unstructured nature of these interviews means that any data collected is going to be very unreliable. Or we could talk about practical disadvantages in that unstructured interviews are exceptionally time-consuming, particularly when you are discussing a complex issue like community sentencing. Item B. Writing from an interactionist perspective, Becker argued that crime and deviance is socially constructed. This means that an act can only become criminal or deviant once a society labels it as such. He argued that these criminal labels are often applied to individuals in society by powerful agencies and can have long-term effects on the individual. Source: Becker, Outsiders, New York, The Free Press, 1963. From item B, identify and explain how labelling can lead to some people committing crime, including what you know of Becker's perspective, 4 marks. So we are going to spend around about 4 to 5 minutes reading the item and writing our answer. And in terms of the breakdown of the marks, you can receive 1 mark for AO1, and that is the reason you identify to explain how labelling can lead to some people committing crime. And then a further 3 marks with regards to AO2, and that is you providing good explanation through the use of theories, terminology, examples, and also making sure you put that in the context of Becker's perspective. And with regards to Becker's perspective, you can absolutely use the item in the exam to remind yourself of some of the key arguments of Becker, but you do also need to go into the exam very confident on all of your key studies, and Becker is one of those. So just to remind you, Becker is writing from an interactionist perspective. This means that Becker does not focus on the big structures in society, but more on the conversations and the interactions that people have on a day-to-day basis. And when it comes to crime, Becker's argument is really interesting because he does not believe a criminal act actually exists. He argues it only becomes criminal or deviant when others define it as such. So it's all about the importance and significance of labelling. And Becker argues that labelling can have a really powerful effect on an individual because if someone, particularly a young person, has the label of delinquent attached to them, that can become their master status. And therefore, this young person will internalise this status of troublemaker or delinquent and eventually will start to see themselves in terms of this label. And this is the idea of the self-fulfilling prophecy. So let's have a look how we would put that into a 4-mark answer. From item B, identify and explain how labelling can lead to some people committing crime, including what you know of Becker's perspective, 4 marks. As mentioned in item B, labelling can have long-term effects on someone and lead them to commit more crime. This is because, as identified by Becker, small interactions between people in society can have significant effects over time. Becker argues that when someone is labelled as deviant by society, this may become a person's master status. And over time, this status becomes internalised by the individual, leading to a self-fulfilling prophecy, where they now view themselves as a criminal and therefore see less harm in committing more crime. So you can see in the first sentence there, we have achieved our AO1 by basically arguing that it is labelling that can have long-term effects and lead to someone committing more crime. So the act of someone giving another person a stereotypical label. And hopefully some of that knowledge you would just be able to pull across from what you've already learnt about in education. So make those synoptic links. We've talked there about the power of labelling from teachers. This is absolutely no different, the power of labelling from society or by institutions like the police. We then, though, go on to achieve our AO2 marks by explaining this in more detail. And a really nice, easy way to show the examiner that we are now applying AO2 is in those 3 little words, this is because. So, as mentioned previously, Becker takes the view that actually is not always the big structures in society that have an impact on us as individuals. It is actually the little communications and micro interactions that happen between people every day that can have a really big effect on us over time. And whenever you are discussing the impact of labelling, I would really recommend doing it in the way that we have here, where you explain the process, i.e. someone is given a label, that becomes a status, over time that is internalised by the individual who then starts acting in that way as a self-fulfilling prophecy. Show the link to the examiner from one thing to the next thing to the next thing, because that is how we achieve these AO2 marks. We could also have mentioned in this question that Becker argues that crime and deviance is socially constructed. That means we create it as a society. It is not universal and it does not have to exist. And the way we evidence that is that crimes and deviance have changed between different cultures and between different time periods. A really good example of that would be something like homosexuality, which was previously seen as a deviant act and up until 1967 actually an illegal act, and is now just a normal part of society. And although we don't need to apply evaluation to get 4 marks in this answer, if you did need to evaluate Becker in another question, it's a really good idea to use these structural alternative explanations to create debate, where functionalists and Marxists and feminists would argue that Becker fails to recognise the importance of the big structures or agents of socialisation in society, such as the economy or religion. Identify one advantage of using quantitative methods to investigate ethnic patterns of crime. 4 marks. So you're going to give yourself around about 4 to 5 minutes to answer this question in the exam. And you can achieve 1 mark for your AO1, i.e. identifying the advantage clearly, and then a further 3 AO2 marks in explaining why this is an advantage, but also applying that to the context, which here is ethnic patterns of crime. So whilst it's absolutely fine to use quite a general advantage of using quantitative methods, taking a positivist approach to understanding research methodology in sociology, you do need to then be able to take that general idea and apply it in some way to why that will be useful when we are studying specifically ethnic patterns of crime. So, what do we know about quantitative methods in sociology then? Well, they tend to be, as already mentioned, associated with positivists, who are our more scientific sociologists. And examples of quantitative methods that we might use in sociology include official statistics or questionnaires. So quite often the data obtained through quantitative methods will be numerical, and that means it is likely to be more reliable than qualitative methods such as unstructured interviews or participant observation. And positivists absolutely love using quantitative methods in sociology because they think this is the only way we can identify trends occurring over time. So if we take the example of something like official statistics, because of the quantitative nature of them, we can collect them in the same way every year, and then over time we can build up a picture to make generalisations. Furthermore, quantitative methods like questionnaires tend to be much more practical than lots of qualitative methods, meaning that we can send them out to large groups of people quite quickly and quite cheaply, which positivists also argue means we are going to gain a more representative sample. And finally, quantitative methods tend to be quite ethical, and that is because the researcher is often very detached from the research method. And if we take the example of official statistics again, the researcher and the respondents will never meet with each other, and therefore no harm can be caused. What we've got to try and do is actually apply that to ethnic patterns of crime. And we know through our crime studies that there are certain ethnic minority groups within the UK that are more likely to be victims of crime, are more likely to be involved in stop and searches by police, and are more likely to be given custodial sentences. And they tend to be Asian and Black ethnic minorities. So how could quantitative methods help us to investigate those patterns of crime? Let's have a look at a 4 out of 4 answer. Identify one advantage of using quantitative methods to investigate ethnic patterns of crime. 4 marks. One advantage is that quantitative methods allow the researcher to spot patterns and trends over time. This is because these methods often produce statistical data, which can be displayed in graphs and charts. This is an important advantage when considering ethnic patterns of crime, as the researcher can more easily spot patterns emerging over time, such as offending or victim rates between different ethnic minority groups. So you can see within our answer, we clearly state our advantage in the first sentence to gain our AO1 mark, i.e. we can spot those patterns and trends over time. We then show the examiner that we are applying AO2 knowledge by using that phrase, this is because, and we basically explain a bit of positivist argument here that it is fantastic to gain quantitative data that is numerical that we can display in beautiful graphs and charts. What we then do is put it into context. So we argue that actually we know from our studies of crime that there are ethnic differences within victim rates, offending rates, or custodial sentences. So we basically argue that being able to spot trends in graphs and charts would actually be really useful when looking at specific demographic groups, because we can see if any patterns emerge between them. We could have also applied knowledge here regarding quantitative research, including larger samples. As discussed previously, the practical nature of them often means you can actually reach a broader audience, and this might make our research more representative, particularly of a variety of different ethnic minority groups in the UK. And whenever we have representative data, it means we can more easily make generalisations about ethnic patterns of crime. If we wanted to think about a disadvantage of using these types of methods to investigate ethnic patterns of crime, we would take an interpretivist perspective. And we would basically argue that actually ethnic patterns of crime is a really complex problem in society. And therefore, to try and be able to explain this problem using numerical data, not having the opportunity to sit down and talk at length or observe ethnic minority groups, either as the offender or the victim, makes any findings really invalid. Discuss how far sociologists would agree that men are more likely to commit crime than women. 12 marks. So on these 12 markers, we need to spend around about 12 minutes, and in that time we need to construct a short sociological essay. So we want an introduction that lays out our argument on both sides of the debate. You will always need to construct a two-sided argument on these 12 markers. Then we want our two sides of the argument in lovely chunky peely paragraphs where you use lots of key terminology, the names of sociologists or theorists, and examples where appropriate. And we make sure on those peely paragraphs that we add evaluation at the end of both to avoid juxtaposition evaluation and specifically criticise the point that we have made. And then finally, you need to ensure you've got a short conclusion where you actually do reach a decision on the debate question that you have been given. In terms of the structure of the mark scheme on this one, you can achieve 4 marks for your AO1, i.e. your lovely sociological accurate knowledge. You can receive 4 marks for your AO2, the way that you are able to apply this knowledge and these examples to the specific question. And then really important, 4 marks for AO3, the ability to be able to criticise each of the points that you make. And particularly within the crime topic, there are some typical ideas that come up time and time again. You've got an example of that here. Are men more likely to commit crime than women? So obviously a gender-based question. But social class comes up a lot, as does ethnicity. So really do prepare for 2 sides of the argument on each of those 3 topics. And with regards to this specific question, we are obviously going to be applying our theoretical knowledge. And because the question is regarding males and females, we need to apply some feminism. And actually, that would be a top tip from me. If in your question it ever mentions men or women, that is a real hint that you should apply some feminism within your answer. And there is certainly a lot of statistical evidence to support the view in this statement. Best statistic you could take going into the exam is the fact that 96% of the prison population in the UK are male. And that would be a great indicator of men being more criminal than women. On the other hand, the most sophisticated sociologist is going to be able to question the validity of those statistics. Just as we do any official statistics in sociology, we know that they do not give the full extent or the full picture of crime, because they do not represent crimes that have not been reported to the police. They do not represent crimes that are not then recorded by the police. And this is where sociologists refer to that dark figure of crime where we don't really know how much crime is being committed by either gender. Also, when we are considering gender and crime, we need to be really careful not to fall into the stereotypical views that we might have discussed in other topics. For example, within families and households, we have discussed the view that women are unequal and that women are living in a patriarchal, exploited nuclear family structure. Clearly, this is not the case within crime, Because men are more likely to be convicted of a crime, men are more likely to be given a harsher sentence. So if anything, the crime section of our course kind of points towards women having a bit of a better deal than men. And that's where this becomes quite tricky, because you've got to find that side of the argument that actually says, no, women are just as likely to commit crime as men. Let's have a look at how we might do that in a top band answer. Discuss how far sociologists would agree that men are more likely to commit crime than women. 12 marks. When considering gender differences in crime, statistics clearly suggest that men are much more likely to commit crime than women. This may be due to patriarchal structures or simply reveal the weakness of relying on official statistics. So we have a lovely introduction there that does everything that it needs to. We first of all refer to the question and support that with trends that we can see in statistical data. But we then start to lay out our argument by arguing it could be due to patriarchal structures, using that term patriarchal to show the examiner that we understand the concepts linked to feminism. And we also understand that that is the theory that we need to apply to this question. We then finally hint at the idea that actually lots of our evidence regarding men being more likely to commit crime than women come from official statistics that we know may not be a valid measure of crime in society. Over 90% of prisoners within the UK are male, which supports the view that men are more likely to commit crime than women. Feminists would argue that this is because we live in a highly patriarchal society, and therefore women have a lack of opportunity to commit crime due to being controlled by men. An example of this would be women being confined to the home to take care of children, or to carry out domestic duties, which means they lack the potential to commit crimes such as fraud, which often takes place within a workplace. Girls may also be socialised differently to boys within the family, leading to them being submissive and cautious, which may also make them less likely to take risks committing crime. However, this view could be criticised as they fail to recognise the changing position of women in society, giving women more opportunities within the workforce, and consequently there has been a rise in pink crime, which refers to female offending. So in this first paragraph, we make our point very clear that actually it is the percentage of prisoners in the UK that may make us assume men are more likely to commit crime than women, supporting that with a statistic. That statistic of over 90% is absolutely fine to use in an exam. Examiners do not expect you to have the exact percentage as long as you are able to give information on a general trend. And here that general trend is men are massively overrepresented within the prison service in the UK. We start to then cleverly explain this statistic through using feminism. As mentioned, it's quite hard to use feminism when it comes to the crime topic because women seem to be having a pretty good deal here, but we managed to use it by arguing that actually maybe the patriarchal control that women experience is why women can't commit crime. We are so oppressed within the family, for example, that we just don't have the time or the ability or the opportunity to commit crime in the same way that men do. I.e., women are not going out to work every day potentially. Women are not going to the pub after work. Women are not going out at the weekend with their mates, and therefore they just lack any opportunity to commit crime. We then add another AO2 explanation within that paragraph. Some sociology students may be more comfortable applying this in a separate paragraph. Personally, I think it reads much more like a sociological essay when you are able to link ideas together. And here we are referring to primary socialisation. So we come back to that basic argument in sociology that between the years of 0 and 5, girls and boys rely on their parents or their guardians to socialise them correctly for the society that they are being brought up in. And here we are taking a view that a sociologist like Anne Oakley might take, that girls within the family are socialised differently to boys. So we are also able to bring across synoptic knowledge here from that family's topic, where we considered why girls might be more likely to take the expressive role within the family, i.e. the homemaker, and why boys might be more likely to take the breadwinner role. We then criticise this using a phrase that we should be very familiar with whenever we are discussing feminism and potentially slightly outdated views regarding the role of women in society, and that phrase is the changing position of women. So here we are referring to the fact that women are no longer isolated within the home carrying out domestic chores. Women are just as likely to work as men, and therefore women now do have more opportunities to commit crime. And consequently, there has been a rise in this new term called pink crime, which is where females are now offending more frequently. I should just note the female offending rates are still nowhere near the rates of men, but nevertheless, they are heading in an upward trajectory. Other ideas we could have used within that paragraph might have included the crisis of masculinity and this idea that some men in society no longer recognise what their status is because of things like the changing position of women, and therefore they go out and commit crime as a way to gain a higher status. Let's now have a look at the other side of the argument to say that men are not more likely to commit crime than women. Actually, a really difficult kind of idea or concept to get your head around. However, the chivalry thesis, as put forward by Pollock, goes against the view that men are more likely to commit crime and simply argues that due to stereotypes in society regarding male and female roles, women do commit crime, but are just more likely to get away without being accused or given a harsh punishment, which is why there is such a higher proportion of male prisoners. Pollock argues that police, magistrates and judges are more often male and have been socialised to accept the view that women need protecting. Therefore, they are treated differently when they commit a crime to men and are more likely to be let off. This means that when we consider official police statistics as a way of measuring crime, it does not give us a true picture of the extent of male and female crime. However, one could argue this represents an outdated view of women and that they often occupy roles within the judiciary service now. So, within this type of essay, the chivalry thesis is your best piece of evidence to put forward to go against the view that men are more likely to commit crime than women. Because this idea put forward by Pollock in the 1950s basically suggests that women are committing crime, potentially the same numbers of crime as men. They just flutter their eyelashes at the judge or at the policeman and manage to get let off. Obviously quite a controversial and potentially outdated view in modern society, but nonetheless it is a well-respected theory that you can use in any essay where you are trying to argue that women can commit crime. Pollock actually stated himself that men hate to accuse women and thus send them to their punishment. Police officers dislike to arrest them, district attorneys to prosecute them, judges and juries to find them guilty, and so on. So we have this idealised, rose-tinted view in society of women as being vulnerable and needing to be protected. And Pollock argues as long as women play up to that stereotypical role, then they are likely to be let off and therefore they will not be recognised within crime statistics in the same way that men will. We also use this as an opportunity to show the examiner that we understand the limitations of official statistics, and I would really recommend doing that in any essay that you get where you are writing about social class, gender or ethnicity. Really evaluate the use of the statistics, because most of the trends that we have about these demographic characteristics will be a consequence of those official police statistics. Finally, we take the typical evaluation of Pollock here to say, can we really apply this theory from the 1950s, where women were much more likely to just be a homemaker, to 2024, whereby women are and should be seen as equal to men? As stated in the evaluation here, we now have women that work in the police force. We now have women who are judges, and therefore Pollock's argument just does not make sense. Clearly, there is something else going on here to explain why women are so unrepresented within the prison system. To conclude, the stark differences in prison population may suggest men commit more crime, but we do need to be cautious in trusting these figures as they do not show us the true nature or extent. So once again, we just make that argument that actually, if we just rely on official statistics to consider men being more criminal than women, we have to take this with a pinch of salt, because we know official statistics do not give us a true picture of the extent of crime in society. Discuss how far sociologists would agree that the media largely influences crime in society. 12 marks. So you are going to allocate around about 12 minutes to complete this answer. And in terms of the breakdown of your marks, you can achieve 4 marks for your AO1, that is your fantastic sociological knowledge and explanation of theories. 4 marks for your AO2, that is your ability to be able to apply these theories to the specific question. And then 4 marks for your AO3, that is you being able to criticise these theories, again using terminology and concepts where appropriate. So in terms of the structure of your essay, to make sure that you can hit all of those marks, you need to include a short introduction where you just highlight some key concepts in the question and lay out the basis of your debate. I would argue then the best format is 2 chunky, peely paragraphs where you add loads of lovely AO2 to show the examiners that you can show links between ideas within sociology. Some students feel more confident breaking that down into maybe 2 shorter paragraphs, which is also absolutely fine, as long as you include that evaluation at the end where you specifically criticise the point that you have made. And then finally, you need a short conclusion where you reach a decision. So with regards to this question then, quite difficult to decide the 2 sides of your argument. You would argue on the one side that the media does largely influence crime in society. I would always recommend starting with the side of the debate that goes hand in hand with the question that you have been given. And then in your second paragraph, flipping that around and saying, actually, it is not the media that influence crime in society. And there you have obviously got to find something else that influences crime in society more than the media. I think the easiest one to go with would be public opinion, because then you can create this really lovely debate between, well, what influences what? Is it the media that influences public opinion, or is it public opinion that influences the media? And when we consider public opinion in sociology, we are going back to some of those functionalist arguments that Durkheim put forward, that people do discuss crime in society and crime is inevitable. And therefore, in that coming together and being shocked about crime, people might influence the way the media reports on that. And just with regards to that term in the question, influences crime in society, that refers to the way the media may make us think that there is more crime than there really is. Or it might also relate to the types of crime that are reported within the media. And again, we know that there are some types of stories that are just going to create more of a buzz and are just going to sell more newspapers. And this is often referred to as media amplification, i.e. the way the media might exaggerate the importance of a particular issue. So now we understand our 2 sides of the debate here, let's have a look at a top-down model answer. Discuss how far sociologists would agree that the media largely influences crime in society, 12 marks. The media is a key agency of secondary socialisation in society, and as such, any views it promotes with regards to crime is likely to be internalised by the public. However, some would argue that the media simply reflects society. So we very simply lay out the 2 sides of our argument in that introduction and also identify that the media definitely is seen as a significant form of secondary socialisation, particularly by our structural sociologists, i.e. functionalists, feminists, Marxists, who really do argue that any type of secondary socialisation that takes place through an influential structure does have a large impact on us as individuals and as a society. Some structural theories will see that as a good thing, like functionalists. Some structural theorists, like Marxists and feminists, will see that as a negative thing. One way the media could be accused of influencing crime in society is due to the creation of moral panics. This refers to the idea that the media deliberately promotes the danger or criminal activities of certain groups, which leads to society becoming fearful. Through sensationalised headlines and shocking images, newspapers can ultimately whip people into a frenzy and a danger that does not really exist. Cohen argues that the media often exaggerates some criminal threats in this way to create a folk devil in order to sell more products. And this creates a panic in wider society, such as happened with the mods and rockers. This refers to focused media attention on a fight between these 2 young groups, which terrified parents and ultimately led to arrests being made and police focusing on crimes that were fairly minor. However, in postmodern society, with social media now becoming more popular than newspapers and the individual becoming the journalist, these types of newspaper tactics are not as influential. So here we go straight into the theory of moral panics associated with Cohen, who is ultimately influenced by labelling theory. And in his study in 1972 of mods and rockers, he found that the media response to what was a very minor event between two groups of young people led to the creation of a folk devil, i.e. it led to this idea that young people were violent and out of control. But this term can now be related to any type of group in society whereby the newspaper sensationalises reports about them. So it could be football hooliganism, it could be people trying to come into the country illegally, it could be benefit cheats. Anything that newspapers feel could create this idea of a moral panic and therefore an out of proportion response from the general public and then ultimately the police. So a really fascinating theory to apply to any question regarding the media. And certainly if you do, you've got to make sure you get those concepts in there of moral panic, folk devil, and of course sensationalisation of the newspapers. But of course we have to evaluate that, and the best way to evaluate Cohen's study is to think about the fact he was writing in 1972. The media is completely different now to how it was 30 or 40 years ago. We are now more likely to be influenced by YouTube, by TikTok, by Snapchat, and therefore the use of shocking headlines by newspapers is not going to be as effective in actually creating these types of panics. If you didn't feel confident writing about Cohen and moral panics, you could in this paragraph have included information about the way that the media plays a role in agenda setting, i.e. deciding the focus of public debate, discussions about crime, and then ensuring they focus lots of attention on those stories. And we could have also discussed how media gatekeepers, i.e. the owners of media, decide what they consider is newsworthy, i.e. the headlines that are going to attract the most readers and therefore make them the most profit. From a Marxist perspective, we would obviously come at this from the angle that the ruling class control the media and therefore they ensure that any reporting of crime within the media focuses attention on the working class and therefore distracts attention away from the ruling class. And a little interesting fact for you, that when it comes to tabloid journalism, i.e. newspapers like The Sun, there is sometimes up to 30% of the newspaper taken up by crime stories, which really does support the view that crime can make the media a lot of money. Moving on to the other side of the argument. Sociologists may also disagree with the view media influences crime in society by arguing that the media simply reflects public concern about crime that already exists. It may be the case that regardless of the media attention, the public are naturally interested in crime, which is inevitable and a vital part of a healthy society according to Durkheim. Therefore, the media is not influential or responsible and simply reflects public debate that is already taking place about criminality. Crimes that the public may be interested in include benefit cheats or illegal immigrants, and these are often cited through public opinion polls. However, one could still argue that the media exaggerates the nature and extent of these crimes to create further public concern. So our other side of the argument here is quite a simple one, really. It's just that it is not the media that influences crime in society. It is the public who already have concerns about crime because that is natural and healthy according to Durkheim within society. And then the media really acts as a mirror to society, just writing about the concerns that the public already have. And there are some specific examples there of the types of public debates that always gain attention within the media, but are always referenced within political opinion polls with regards to the crimes that the British public are most worried about, i.e. the types of crime that might affect them. So you've got the idea about benefits cheats, i.e. people being concerned that they are paying their taxes for someone else to come along and steal them who isn't willing to get a job. Other types of public concern with regards to crime that come up time and time again relate to sentencing. So there is much public debate about whether prisoners are being given too lenient a sentence, whether when they are in prison that is a harsh enough environment, and also why some offenders are let out before others. And then we've got our evaluation at the end that basically argues that when the media do pick up on public concern, they still exaggerate the nature and extent, i.e. they still sensationalise these type of events, and they still make sure they had set an agenda with regards to reporting on that type of crime for a long period. In conclusion, it is likely the media reflects concerns the public already have and exaggerate the extent of these in order to make profit. So we conclude by basically saying it's probably a combination of the two. The public is always going to be interested in crime, particularly those crimes that affect them, but also the media pick up on this and they do influence crime in society by targeting specific groups, as happened in Cohen's study of the mods and rockers. Identify the term commonly used by sociologists to describe the ability for people to move up and down a social class system. Fill one circle only, 1 mark. A. Absolute poverty. B. Social mobility. C. Standard of living. D. Affluence. So we are only going to spend around about 1 mark reading and completing our answer to this question. Do make sure that you read all 4 options very carefully though, as there will often be options of concepts that seem very similar. So if we just run through all of the options to try and decide which would be the correct answer then, A refers to absolute poverty. And this really refers to the most extreme poverty that people can experience in society. So it's not a sort of level of poverty that we would refer to within the UK. Here we would refer more to relative poverty, i.e. not having as much as those around us, but absolute poverty where you potentially do not have the correct shelter or food or clean drinking water in order to survive would be associated more with the developing world. Clearly then, not a term associated with moving up and down a social class system. If we have a look at C, standard of living, and this refers to the quality of material goods and public services available to any given population. So a really important and fantastic little phrase to use when we are considering the levels of wealth within a country, but obviously does not relate therefore to moving up and down a social class system. D, affluence, refers to the wealth that an individual or a society may have, so clearly not related to moving up and down a social class system, but is a very important concept within this topic because often if one is affluent, that affects their life chances greatly in a really positive way. So the affluent people in society often have the most power, particularly if we think about this from a Marxist perspective and the ruling class's influence over the working class who are not affluent. So B is the final answer we reach, social mobility, which absolutely does match that term in the question, moving up and down a social class system. And when it comes to social mobility, think back to your education topic and the idea that schools are meritocratic institutions, i.e. you should be able to enter your school as a working class student, and by working hard and achieving great academic success within your exams, you should be able to leave the working class and move up the social hierarchy and become middle class. However, obviously in sociology there is great debate about whether schools are meritocratic or whether society as a whole is meritocratic, and we really do have effective social mobility based on a person's ability. Identify the term commonly used by sociologists to describe prejudice or discrimination in society based on gender. Fill 1 circle only, 1 mark. A, racism. B, globalisation. C, sexism. D, ageism. And as always on these multiple choice questions, you should only be allocating a minute or 2 to reading the question and the key concepts and deciding which one most fits the description given. So you've got a variety of concepts here that are very important within different parts of sociology. A, we've got racism, which is a common word used in society to describe discrimination based on ethnicity or nationality. B, we've got globalisation, which is another term that comes up across all of our sociology topics and refers to the idea that the world has become interconnected. And some of the key features of globalisation are increased movement of people through immigration or migration, and also the use of technology worldwide, such as the internet. For D, we've got ageism, which refers to a bias in society against people based on their age. Ageism can actually occur with young people or old people, and it might refer to ideas that we have in society like older people being weaker or less able to work. And then finally for C, we have sexism, which clearly then matches the description that we have in our question, prejudice or discrimination or stereotyping based on gender. And the kind of sexism that we tend to study in sociology links to ideas within the feminist theory, and that women and girls are being unequally treated based on their gender. So examples that we might look at include the gender pay gap, whereby men and women who perform the same roles in society may be paid different amounts. Currently, the gender pay gap sits at around about 12%, so clearly sexism is still a feature of modern society. We do need to be careful, though, not just to assume that sexism only occurs for females. There are examples in society of sexism that negatively affects males. So that might be a stereotypical view that men cannot perform the role of a house husband. Or that might be when we consider crime statistics, the fact that judges are more likely to hand down custodial sentences to men than they are women. Describe one example of an achieved status, 3 marks. So you are only going to allocate around about 3 minutes to write a description of the concept given here. And as a reminder, on these 3-mark questions, you can only achieve AO1 marks, meaning that the examiner will be looking to award you marks solely on your use of knowledge, key concepts, terminology, and where appropriate, theories. And with an example question such as the one in front of you, I would really recommend structuring your answer by starting with providing the example for the examiner and then explaining why this is an example or giving some brief description about why this is an example of an achieved status. If you struggle with that explanation, you can sometimes apply the theory or the sociologist with the key concept. That would help you to achieve AO1 marks. And if you are really struggling in the exam, you could also try to discuss the importance or significance of such a key concept. And when it comes to status in society, sociologists tend to recognise that there are 2 types of status: an ascribed status or an achieved status. An ascribed status is a position in society that we are born into or have no control over, for example, our hair colour or eye colour. Whereas an achieved status is down to our individual merits and is quite often based on our abilities or our hard work. And with regards to an achieved status in society, quite often there will be associated rewards. So for example, if you have worked very hard to achieve a very good degree at university, the idea is that you will have an achieved status of being a graduate and therefore you can get a better paid job. So, with that in mind, let's have a look at a model answer. Describe one example of an achieved status, 3 marks. An achieved status includes having an important job in society, such as a doctor or lawyer. This is because this job has been achieved through hard work or ability. So, you can see within this answer, we clearly identify the achieved status within the first sentence, i.e. having an important job. And then we further support that example with some specific ideas about jobs that are given this high status in society, i.e. a doctor or lawyer. It is generally recognised in society that both of these jobs take a lot of hard work, dedication and skill, and therefore there is a status that goes alongside that. There is also the recognition that to become a doctor or a lawyer, you cannot be born into a family. You have to actually work hard to gain qualifications. Other examples that we could have included in this question are becoming a member of an exclusive club or an organisation, such as an athlete. So, for example, if you are an Olympian, there is a huge status of achievement that goes alongside that, and it is recognised that you must have trained very hard and worked very hard in order to be able to get to that elite level. And as discussed previously, any sort of educational achievement, such as obtaining a degree or a PhD in a subject, means that you have an achieved status, and we expect there to be rewards that go along that status to recognise the hard work and ability that goes alongside that. And the idea of meritocracy that we will be familiar with from our education module also links really nicely to this idea of an achieved status. Because our sociological groups like functionalists would argue that as we do live in a meritocratic society, we all have a very equal and fair go at gaining a highly recognised achieved status. Obviously, other sociological groups such as Marxists and feminists would argue that this is a rose-tinted way to view achieved status and meritocracy, and that actually some people have a much greater head start than others. Identify and describe a policy that the government may introduce to address poverty. 3 marks. As usual, we will only spend around about 3 minutes answering this question, so we are just looking for a couple of sentences in the exam. And it is absolutely vital that you do go into this stratification topic very confident in understanding a number of different government policies. I know that students sometimes find politics quite tricky within sociology, but it really does help to have to hand a handful of contemporary government policies regarding issues like poverty in society. In certain questions on this stratification topic, you may even be able to pull over some of the examples that you already have from families and from education, meaning that you are using your synoptic knowledge wisely. And another reminder that this 3-mark question is only awarding AO1 marks. So that means once you have identified your policy, you need to support that with accurate sociological knowledge. So that might be the use of theories, terminology, concepts, examples. So now we know how we're going to structure this one, let's have a look at some of the content within the question that we would need to understand in order to answer it. So the term policy refers to a specific act or law introduced by the government. And just be careful that in some questions you might actually get a time period that policy has to fall between, i.e. the last 30 years. So do make sure you go into the exam with some very contemporary examples. And here we are looking for specific laws that may help to tackle poverty. And when it comes to tackling poverty, there are a variety of different ways that the government might do that. It doesn't just mean handing money to people. So it might be any kind of policies that aim to redistribute wealth. It might be any kind of policies that aim to improve healthcare for the poorest people in society. It might be housing initiatives to ensure that people have access to more affordable housing. It might even be providing young people with a hot school dinner. So when we think about poverty, there are a variety of different ways that a government can try and tackle that. Therefore, within your answer, you need to make sure you do identify the policy, but then also support that with some knowledge about how that is going to actually address poverty. And just with regards to that term poverty, the government chooses to recognise people living in households with an income below 60% of median income in any 1 year. So any policy that might be means tested to support those types of people could be an initiative to address poverty. So let's have a look at a model answer. Identify and describe a policy that the government may introduce to address poverty. 3 marks. One example of a policy would be child benefit, which ensures that anyone responsible for a child and earning under £50,000 receives financial support. This should help to ensure children are less likely to experience hardship. So you can see within this answer, we specifically identify our policy in the first sentence, which is child benefit. We support that policy with a little bit of detail about how it works, i.e. anyone earning under £50,000 receives some support. And then we explain that this should help to ensure children do not experience financial hardship. And just to give you some more information about child benefit, because it is a very good example of a policy to use in the exam, as mentioned, it is not universal. It is a means-tested policy that the government has in place, which means that people have to apply for it and have to provide proof of their income. And the amount that parents will be paid every 4 weeks really does depend on the income of that household. So if you are at the top end of that and anyone in the household is earning over £50,000, you are likely to not receive much child benefit at all. There has been talk of this rising to £60,000, which also just evidences how important it is you are keeping up to date with the news in order to be able to understand the most contemporary social policies the government's introducing. And obviously that money is not paid directly to the child, it is paid to the parent or the guardian of that child. Other examples of social policies that we could have included to address poverty are national insurance benefits or job seekers allowance. So this means people may be entitled to claim some sort of benefits if they become unemployed. We could also use the example of the National Health Service. That's one that people always forget is a policy that the government provides for us, and that ensures everyone is able to receive good healthcare at the point of need. And the idea is that is from the cradle to the grave, so from the moment you are born to the moment that you die. And if you wanted a really contemporary example to use in the exam, you could discuss initiatives that have happened in education, such as all reception children being entitled to a hot meal for free every day. Item C. Pensioners living in poverty after housing costs, millions. Source: households below average income for financial years ending 1995 to 2020, DWP 2021. Figures after housing cost. From item C, examine one strength of the research. So you should only be spending a couple of minutes on this question in the exam, and you will be awarded a maximum of 2 marks for your skills of evaluation. You will get 1 mark for correctly examining a strength, and then a further mark for being able to provide a reason as to why this is a strength. And although you are given an item, and although it is a very good idea to examine that item in some detail, you are certainly not expected to be drawing conclusions from the data or to be analysing the specific data in lots and lots of detail. You really are providing a bit more of a general analysis or evaluation when we are considering using official statistics in general in sociology. It's always very, very worthwhile reading that source bit at the bottom of your item and the title at the top, because quite often this will give us a clue to examining a strength or, in other questions, a weakness of the research. And typically when it comes to official statistics, we are thinking about our positivists. So our scientific sociologists who really do believe that we should be studying sociology in the same sort of systematic way that scientists may be studying biology or chemistry. And just finally, before we have a look at a model answer, there is no need in this question to put it into the context of pensioners. But just to ensure you do understand the data you have in front of you here, on the left-hand side going up there, you've got the number in millions of pensioners living in poverty after they have paid for their housing. And along the bottom, you have the years. So we can very clearly see that there has not been a huge change from 1994 to 2019 to 2020 in the number of pensioners who are living in poverty. So now we understand it, let's have a look at a model answer. From item C, examine one strength of the research, 2 marks. One strength of the research is that it has been carried out with a very large sample, including millions of pensioners. This means that the data obtained should be highly representative for the population and generalisations can be made. So you can see in this answer we refer straight away to the strength being the sample size, and it really is a feature of official statistics from the government. In this case we've got the Department for Work and Pensions, where you can achieve such a huge sample that would be totally out of the grasp or reach of most sociologists. And therefore, whenever we complement a study for the size of its sample, we are also arguing that that sample should be representative of the population, i.e. it contains the demographic characteristics of the population that it is studying. And whenever we get representative data, that means we can be more confident that generalisations can be made, and that means statements that can be applied to the whole population. Other examples that we could have used is the fact that statistical data allows sociologists to spot trends and patterns over time. So the fact with this data we have results going back all the way to 1994 means that we are able to see how these numbers have changed over time. It is also a highly ethical way to research poverty within pensioners because all data is anonymised, and that is a feature of all official statistics, which means that participants are not identified and therefore they cannot be harmed in any way. Identify and explain one factor that may lead to pensioners experiencing inequality in society as shown in item C. 4 marks. So allocating around about 4 minutes to completing this answer, and you can achieve 1 mark for your AO1, i.e. identifying the factor, and then 3 further AO2 marks for explaining this factor with some sociological knowledge, including key concepts and examples. You should already be familiar with the item in the exam because it is very likely you will have already had to think about either a strength or a weakness of using official statistics. However, it is obviously best practice to have another look at it before you attempt this question. And once again, the examiners are not expecting you to do any sort of data analysis within this answer. They just want you to use the item to identify a sociological factor that can explain the trend. And obviously the trend that we can see here is high levels of pensioners, that is older people who are no longer economically active, living in poverty after housing costs. And we can see that that number doesn't really ever drop much below the 2 million mark over the 30 years that we have of statistics available. So there are a variety of factors that we might consider to try and explain why pensioners experience inequality. We might consider the fact that they are less likely to be economically active, i.e. they are no longer receiving a wage every month and they are relying on state pension. That pension might not be high enough. Maybe we could consider the fact that pensioners might be more likely to be living in a one-person household. Maybe their partner has unfortunately passed away and therefore they are trying to manage bills on their own. It might be that they have a lack of savings for their retirement and therefore they are relying on state handouts. Or it may even be linked to higher life expectancy. We do have an ageing population in the UK, and whilst that is fantastic that people are living longer, it does mean that for some people they are living longer in a very frail condition. So it may be that they have rising healthcare costs, maybe they are having to live in more specialised supported housing that is very costly. You just need to decide on the factor that you think you can explain best using some sociological language. Let's have a look at a 4 out of 4 answer. Identify and explain one factor that may lead to pensioners experiencing inequality as shown in item C, 4 marks. One factor that may lead to pensioners experiencing inequality in society, as shown in item C, is age discrimination. This means that older people are treated negatively, specifically because of their old age. People may stereotype pensioners as being unhealthier or weaker than a younger adult and less able to contribute to society. This may prevent the pensioner from obtaining employment, and therefore they are forced to rely on only state handouts and pensions which may not be enough for them to live comfortably. So within this answer, we identify our factors straight away to achieve our AO1 mark, and that is age discrimination. Age discrimination can take place with young people, middle-aged people or older people. Just typically, it tends to occur in our society when someone reaches retirement. And it means that we stereotype those people negatively based on their age. It has also been described as an age patriarchy. So we assume that older people are not able to act in the same way younger people are. We then provide some examples based on the inequality as shown in item C, and the easiest one to use is the fact that pensioners are more likely to be economically inactive. That means they are not working and they are being supported by the taxpayer. Now, we are assuming that those pensioners want to retire and want to not work. However, there are examples from around the world now where people are retiring later and later. and where older people are choosing to work well into their 70s, 80s, and potentially even 90s. Japan is a fantastic example of that. However, we are somewhat behind this in the UK, and despite the fact we have an ageing population, many people do retire in their mid-60s, and therefore they are then forced to rely on either state handouts or pensions or the savings that they have managed to amass during their lifetime. As people are now living so much longer, if people have got savings, they are having to make those savings stretch for much longer periods of time. And this type of discrimination or bias against older people in society can be supported by things like the media, where if you think about the TV programmes you watch and the way older people are represented, it may be that they are assumed to be frail, weak, forgetful, and no longer able to contribute to society. Identify and explain one weakness of using content analysis to study the role of members of parliament in society. 4 marks. So we should only be spending around about 4 to 5 minutes answering this question, and you can achieve 1 AO1 mark for the suitable weakness given, and then a further 3 AO2 marks with regards to the explanation of why this is a weakness using theories, using key concepts and terminology. But obviously with this question, we need to ensure to get the 4 out of 4 that we also put that into the specific context. And here the context that we have is the role of members of parliament in society. So just to remind you of what content analysis is, it's a slightly unusual research method used whereby the researcher tries to analyse normally written pieces of work and attempts to try and code that written work in some way. So, for example, that might include the examiner noting down how many times a specific phrase or word comes up in a piece of text. So, from content analysis, we achieve quantitative data. Now, with regards to the strengths of that type of analysis in general, it is obviously a very practical, easy, often free way to research society. However, there are plenty of weaknesses attached to that type of research method. So, for example, every researcher will code a piece of text slightly differently to another, meaning that it could be considered to be quite a subjective way to research society. It also means that the researcher has to work with what is already available. This will be secondary sources that the researcher is providing content analysis for, and therefore it might not suit the specific questions or needs of the sociologist. And also, it is a very, very time-consuming way to research society, particularly if you are dealing with very complex information. Now, if we take the second part of this 4 marker and we are considering the roles of MPs in society, just to remind you, an MP is someone who is locally elected by a constituency to represent them within the House of Commons. An MP might be associated or attached to a specific political party, such as the Conservative Party or the Labour Party, or they may just stand independently as an MP. And the reason why they are an important group to consider in this topic within sociology is because they hold power and influence in society. So they really are the lawmakers of this country. And therefore, from a sociological perspective, it's really important to understand their role and also understand what kind of people they are. Do they tend to come from one type of ethnicity, one type of social class, or one type of gender? So let's have a look at a model answer where we apply a weakness of the research method content analysis to the role of MPs. Identify and explain one weakness of using content analysis to study the role of members of parliament in society. 4 marks. One weakness of using content analysis to study the roles of MPs in society is that the research obtained will be descriptive and therefore will not show meaning or causality. This is because the data obtained normally just identifies patterns within the content studied. This means that the researcher will not be able to explain in detail the complex and varied role of MPs from their perspective. So you can see within that first sentence, we identify the weakness of content analysis, which we could apply to almost any content analysis study, and that is that the research obtained really lacks deep meaning. And an interpretivist would certainly argue that that is one of the main limitations of using a quantitative method such as this. And what we then go on to do is explain why this is a specific weakness in the context of understanding the role of MPs. And as previously mentioned, MPs hold an extremely important and significant role in modern society, but that is a very complex and varied role, and therefore it may involve the researcher having to examine very complicated pieces of text and to try and interpret these complicated pieces of text into simplified coding could prove to be very difficult and could also mean that we lose real insight into the role of this group. Therefore, it might be much more appropriate to use a method such as participant observation, where you are gaining real insight into the day-to-day life of an MP in society, who have a very specific job role that's quite unique. We could have also mentioned the fact that the researcher gets to decide the coding categories when it comes to analysing this content, and therefore, if the researcher has a particular political bias, i.e. they are a member of the Conservative Party or the Labour Party, for example, they might actually find subjective results based on their predetermined ideas about MPs. Item D. Marx argued that in a capitalist society, the economy is the base of all power relationships. The ruling class own the means of production, allowing them to exploit the working class, who have only their labour to sell. The ruling class then use other institutions such as education and ideology to maintain their power. Source: Marx K. Selected Writings 1857 to 1867 in McClellan D. Karl Marx Selected Writings 2nd edition, Oxford University Press, 2000. From item D, identify and explain who holds power in society, including what you know of Marx's perspective. 4 marks. So a reminder, you should be spending around about 4 to 5 minutes answering this question, and you can be awarded 1 mark for AO1, i.e. that is in your identification of who holds power in society. And the further 3 marks are AO2, so that is the extra sociological knowledge that you apply, and in the case of this question, that is what you know about Karl Marx's perspective about power in society. So the way you should structure your answer is to very clearly identify who holds power and then to apply extra knowledge. Absolutely make sure that you read the item carefully in these types of questions, because they do give you some hints and tips about the answer. Obviously, though, you do need to apply your own knowledge too, bringing in key terminology or examples to support Marx's perspective. There is a temptation in these questions to start analysing and evaluating Marx, potentially criticising his view of who holds power, but as there are no AO3 marks awarded, I would suggest avoiding this approach. So Karl Marx is obviously a very significant study that you should go into the exam being aware of within every single topic. And once you understand the key features of Marxism, it really is just a case of taking the same ideology and applying it to different situations. Here, though, we are discussing the fundamentals of Marxist theory with regards to wealth and power. So Karl Marx really sees social stratification of a mechanism allowing only a few ruling class or bourgeoisie in society to be able to exploit the rest of society. And this all comes back to, for Karl Marx, who owns the means of production within a capitalist society. Because for Karl Marx, all power, including political power, comes from capitalism, and all other institutions and agents of socialisation in society, from the family to the media to religion, are just a means of transmitting the correct ideology to support capitalism and maintain the status quo of the bourgeoisie or the elite. Finally, Marx sees, as a consequence of this growing divide between the rich and the poor, that eventually the gap will become so great that there will be a revolution. And this is where Karl Marx proposes this new type of society of communism, where capitalism does not exist and society becomes a classless society. So, it's some very big and quite complicated ideas that in this question we need to try and summarise to get our 4 marks. Let's have a look at how we might do that. From item D, identify and explain who holds power in society, including what you know of Marx's perspective. 4 marks. From item D, Marx explains that the ruling class in society hold power due to the fact they own the means of production. Marx argues that in a capitalist society, two classes typically emerge: the ruling class who own factories and make profit, and the working class who have only their labour to sell, little power and are therefore exploited. The ruling class are able to pass laws to ensure that they maintain their power in society and keep the working class subordinated. So what we have done here is try to take some very big and quite complicated ideas from Karl Marx and power and put them into a nice, succinct couple of sentences. We get our AO1 mark in that first sentence by explaining that it is the ruling class in society who hold power according to Karl Marx. And just to go into a bit more detail about this group, Karl Marx identifies the ruling class or the bourgeoisie as those who own the means of production. I.e., remember Karl Marx is writing in the context of the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain and Europe, and therefore he is witnessing these factory owners who are making lots of profit at the expense of large numbers of workers who are often working very long hours in dangerous conditions for very small amounts of money. And Karl Marx argues, therefore, that this is when this class society emerges: those who own factories and make this profit and become very rich, and those who are not able to own factories and therefore can only sell their labour. So essentially we are arguing from Karl Marx's perspective, if you want to understand who holds power in society, you need to understand the economic capitalist base of society. For our AO2 knowledge, we could have also included the fact that the ruling class use their power to exploit the working class as they are focused on their one goal of obtaining as much profit as possible. So, for example, the ruling class might pass laws that benefit the ruling class and are at the expense of the working class. Examples of that might include laws against property. And obviously this question does not require us to evaluate Marx's perspective, but if we did need to do that in other questions, then we would argue typically that this is quite an outdated view nowadays. We do not live in the same industrialised Britain that Karl Marx was viewing, and also he tends to overemphasise the importance of capitalism, therefore understating the importance of other identifiers such as one's gender or one's ethnicity, which can also massively affect your life chances. Identify and explain one way society could be considered patriarchal. 4 marks. So you are only going to spend around about 4 to 5 minutes completing your answer for this question, and you can achieve 1 mark for AO1, that is in your example or identification of a way society could be considered patriarchal, and then you can get a further 3 marks for AO2 in terms of your explanation of why this is a way society may be considered patriarchal with the use of theories, terminology, concepts, examples. So, first of all, we need to ensure that we understand the term in the question. And here we have the term patriarchal, often linked to feminist theory and refers literally to rule by father, i.e. a society whereby men hold the most power. That might be economic power, or that might just be control over women's lives. And this is another term where we can apply our synoptic knowledge because it is one that you should be familiar with across all of the topics that you study. Most commonly coming from a radical feminist perspective, particularly within the families module, where they consider the nuclear family to be the source of patriarchal control within society. So there are loads of examples you could use from across the course, from families and households to education to crime. Let's have a look at a model answer. Identify and explain one way society could be considered patriarchal. 4 marks. One way society could be considered patriarchal is through the gender pay gap. This refers to women on average still earning significantly less than men, despite legislation such as the Equal Pay Act put in place to address this inequality. This is still estimated to be at around 12%, even when men and women perform similar roles. This means that men have more financial control and power in society compared to women. So we use a really common example in this answer, the gender pay gap, which means that men and women performing the same sorts of roles in society are not receiving the same sort of rewards for that, which we could argue means there is still inequality in society between men and women. There are certain legislative acts that I would argue you must go into the exam knowing for almost all of your topics. The 1970 Equal Pay Act is one of them, which meant that it was illegal to pay men and women different amounts if they were actually performing the same role, and also the Sexual Discrimination Act of 1975, which meant women could not be discriminated against within the workplace for something like having a baby. There is still, as you can see in this answer, a gap between what men and women are earning, even if they are performing similar roles. And this goes across public and private sector roles. So clearly a statistic like that is fantastic evidence to use in the exam to support the idea that men and women are not fully equal. Just obviously need to make sure whenever you do use statistical data, you explain why that statistical data is significant. And here we use that phrase, this means that, in order to show the examiner that we are using our AO2 skills. Other examples that we could have used within this question are domestic labour and childcare. So pulling across those examples from the families topic, whereby women may be performing a dual burden, i.e. going out and providing financially for the family in a way that they did not in the past, but then coming home and still performing the domestic duties such as childcare. We could have also referred to the glass ceiling within the workplace, whereby there are barriers put in place of women in terms of their advancement into a profession, so women not being able to achieve the top roles in a company. And evidence that we may have to support that are statistics that suggest fewer than 10% of CEOs at the UK's top 350 companies are female, clearly suggesting that women struggle to obtain the highest and most powerful roles within society. And if we consider women in politics, finally, there are around about 35% of MPs who are female. So although this has increased massively in the last 20 to 30 years, it still shows that women are not equally represented in positions of power. Discuss how far sociologists would agree that ethnicity has the most significant impact on one's life. 12 marks. And to ensure you do get your 12 marks on this question, you need to make sure you can achieve up to 4 marks of AO1 knowledge. That means you are applying accurate sociological knowledge, theory, concepts and examples. That you get up to 4 marks of AO2. That is that you are able to apply this theoretical knowledge and examples and concepts to the specific question. And then finally, up to 4 marks of AO3 in terms of how you are able to criticise the specific points that you have made. And the best way to achieve those 12 marks is to produce a short sociological essay. So that means a short introduction whereby you define ethnicity and also start to lay out a debate about why ethnicity may have an impact on one's life. Is that going to be a positive impact? Is that going to be a negative impact? Are we talking about ethnic majorities or are we talking about ethnic minorities? And then you are going to produce 2 sides of an argument through the use of PhET paragraphs, point, evidence, explain, link and evaluation. And the 2 sides of the argument here are going to be, yes, on the one hand, ethnicity definitely does have the most significant impact on one's life. And you will need to provide specific examples of where ethnicity really can make a difference. When you are considering demographic characteristics like ethnicity or gender or social class, it is quite important that you do have either statistical data to support your analysis, or you have specific examples of where that characteristic is actually having an impact on one's life. And the other side of the argument is going to be that actually, whilst ethnicity might have an impact on one's life, there are other factors that we also need to consider. And those are the factors that you could include in this answer really come from either social class, gender, or one's age. And again, for the most part, we will be discussing how those characteristics can have a negative impact on someone's life. And then finally, a very short conclusion where you just summarise those key points again and ultimately reach a decision on whether ethnicity has got the most significant impact on one's life. Let's just make sure before we look at a model answer that we do understand the terminology within the question. Ethnicity refers to being part of a population or group made up of people who share some sort of common culture. That might include language, that might include religion. And in terms of impact on one's life, we are referring to life chances. And here we are discussing the opportunities that one may have to improve their life. And that may be through their health, through housing, through education, through the type of job they are able to obtain. And therefore, the most common trend that we have in contemporary Britain is that some ethnic minorities do have a poorer life chance than the white majority. So let's explore a top band answer. Discuss how far sociologists would agree that ethnicity has the most significant impact on one's life, 12 marks. Ethnicity refers to one's culture and heritage. There are many ethnic minority groups within the UK, and statistics do seem to suggest that this has a significant impact on one's life chances, such as access to employment. A lovely little introduction here that does everything it needs to. We define what ethnicity refers to, i.e. culture and heritage. We identify that there are lots of different ethnic groups within the UK. And then finally, we show the examiner we understand the line of debate here, i.e. if we are discussing a significant impact on one's life, then we are discussing life chances. And we provide an example of how sociologists may measure life chances through access to employment. I could have used other examples such as access to housing, access to healthcare, or access to good education. Let's have a look at the first side of the argument then. Ethnicity clearly does have a big impact on life chances, which is often negative according to statistical data in the UK. Ethnic minorities are underrepresented in certain high-status roles, as there is a lack of ethnic minority politicians, senior civil servants and judges. This suggests that ethnic minorities lack power and decision-making in the UK, leading to them being marginalised and ultimately having worse life chances. Furthermore, ethnic minorities have worse life chances than the white population in terms of finding and securing work, which leads to material inequality and higher levels of poverty amongst these groups. However, there are laws in place to attempt to address inequality, such as equal opportunity law, and positive discrimination law attempts to address this problem. So, loads of lovely key terminology we can go through within this paragraph then. We refer first of all to the statistical data that shows ethnicity does have a big impact on one's life chances. And we then provide a range of examples of high power or high status roles within society whereby ethnic minorities are underrepresented. So we are arguing here, if you are not able to access the highest status jobs in society, those jobs where people are making decisions about the law, or decisions about sending people to prison, then you lack power and autonomy in society. We use a lovely key sociological term called marginalisation, which refers to ethnic minorities literally being pushed to the margins of mainstream society. And if they are marginalised in mainstream society, then this means that absolutely ethnicity does have a very significant impact on one's life. Note the little phrase, this suggests that. This is one of those key phrases to use in the exam that highlights to the examiner that you are applying AO2 skills, i.e. you are applying and explaining the knowledge that you have presented. Also note the use of that word furthermore, which also emphasises to the examiner that you are applying more knowledge and more application of that knowledge. And here we are talking about the higher levels of poverty amongst groups. So if ethnic minorities in the UK are more likely to experience poverty, then we can definitely conclude that ethnic minority status is having a significant impact on one's life. We then signpost to the examiner that we are now criticising this view through that word however, and we discuss some contemporary laws that have been put in place to try and address inequality of ethnic minorities in the UK. And we then refer to ideas about positive action that may take place within workforces, whereby employers can help groups who do face barriers, such as ethnic minorities, to try and overcome these. Now let's have a look at the other side of the argument. However, Marxists and feminists argue that it is not ethnicity that has the most significant impact on one's life chances. Instead, Marxists argue that social class is more important within a capitalist society, as the working class are exploited based on their place within the social hierarchy. This would mean that an ethnic minority from a higher social class would have greater life chances than a working class member of the ethnic majority. Moreover, feminists argue that it is gender that is more important to consider when assessing life chances due to the patriarchal control women of all ethnicities experience. However, both of these views fail to consider how all three identities may impact life chances together. So the top tip here is, if you get a question about ethnicity, you should evaluate that view through the use of Marxism and feminism, considering social class and gender. And equally, if you get a question about social class, then you will bring in ideas about ethnicity and gender. If you get a question about gender, then you may bring in ideas about ethnicity and social class. So it is really worthwhile going into the exam, having a paragraph on all three characteristics set out in your mind. And both Marxists and feminists take a structural view. For Marxists, it is the big structure of capitalism, the economic base of society, that is going to have the most significant impact on one's life chances. So for Marxists, it doesn't really matter what gender you are, it doesn't really matter what ethnicity you are, it is your social status in society as a member of the working class with only your labour to sell that is going to determine your life chances. And Marxists argue that the ruling class have gotten very good at putting measures in place, such as the passing down of wealth through inheritance, to ensure that that stays the same forever. When it comes to feminism, we are still taking a structural view, but here we are arguing it is the structure of patriarchy and everything that feeds into that patriarchy that is going to affect one's life the most. So for feminists, from the moment that that little baby girl is identified as a female, her life chances change. And that would be a fantastic opportunity to show off your synoptic knowledge as well by bringing in ideas across the course, such as that about the female being exploited within the nuclear family, or women being paid less than men through the gender pay gap. It might also be a really nice opportunity within this question to discuss difference feminism, and this is a group that basically argue we cannot see women as one homogenous group, i.e. women as all the same, and we really need to focus on the individual experiences of patriarchy. So for example, an ethnic minority female may experience patriarchy in a different way to a white Western female. And we evaluate Marxism and feminist views about social class and gender in the way I would always recommend you to on a question of this type, by saying if we want to get the best picture of one's life chances, then we probably need to consider all three of these features of someone together. So how someone of ethnic minority status, who is female, who is from a lower class, may experience the poorest life chances in society. In conclusion, it is clear that life chances can be affected by one's ethnicity, and there should be more laws in place to protect these vulnerable groups. We should, however, also consider the impact of class and gender. So a lovely conclusion whereby we argue that actually it is not okay for ethnic minorities in the UK in 2024 or any other year to experience any kind of lower life chances based solely on their ethnicity, and we should be protecting these types of groups, but that we also need to do that considering other features that may also disadvantage one's life chances. And most commonly in this question, we will bring in class and gender. Just a reminder though, you can talk about age as well, and you could within this question discuss the idea that there is an age patriarchy in the UK whereby either young people or old people experience inequality that may affect their life chances. Discuss how far sociologists would agree that the government should be responsible for financially supporting the poorest in society. 12 marks. So just a reminder of how your marks are allocated within this question. You can achieve up to 4 marks of AO1. That is your ability to show your examiner some fantastic sociological knowledge through theory, through key concepts and through examples. You can achieve up to 4 marks for your AO2 skills, i.e. your ability to apply this theory, these examples and these key concepts to the specific question. And then finally, 4 marks for AO3, your ability to think critically like a sociologist. So can you provide some specific evaluation of the points that you have made? And the best way to make sure that you achieve those 12 marks is to structure a short sociological essay. So we need an introduction where we define key terms where appropriate, but then we also lay out a two-sided argument. Here, one side of that argument is going to be that the government absolutely should be responsible for financially supporting the poorest. That is going to be through initiatives such as the welfare state. And then the other side of your argument is going to be that actually it is the role of the individual in society to support themselves and no one else's. You are then going to open up this debate through 2 lovely chunky peely paragraphs: point, evidence, explain, link and evaluation. Or if you find producing really chunky paragraphs quite difficult in the exam, you can provide some shorter statements, as long as you ensure that you evaluate those statements specifically. And then finally, a short conclusion where you do reach a decision. One of the pitfalls that people could make on an essay question like this one is to try and apply too much of their own opinion. So this is quite a political question that you are being asked, and you may have political views regarding it. However, we are in a sociology exam and the examiner wants to read about sociology. So make sure that in your paragraphs you can support your ideas with evidence and statistics where possible. And on most of these questions in the stratification module, where you are discussing the role of the government, you do need to discuss that from a theoretical perspective. So you need to think about what theorists such as Marxists, functionalists, the New Right think about the role of government in society. It's also a really good idea to go into the exam understanding a few different ways that the government can help people in society. So having some specific social policy and making that as contemporary as possible. So that might include initiatives like universal credit, or that might include initiatives such as council housing. So with all that in mind, let's have a look at a top band answer. Discuss how far sociologists would agree that the government should be responsible for financially supporting the poorest in society. 12 marks. There are several different views regarding the role of the government in providing for the most vulnerable in society. Some people believe that the individual should be responsible for providing for themselves. So there aren't really any key concepts or terms within the question that we need to define in our introduction here, so we just get straight into laying out the 2 sides of our argument. Should the government provide for the most vulnerable? And by the most vulnerable, we are often referring to the poorest in society, those who are unemployed, or maybe those who are unable to work. And the other side of the argument that actually it is about individual responsibility and people should financially provide for themselves, i.e. through getting a job and providing a positive function for wider society. Just to make sure we are aware when it comes to a question like this in the exam, governments do not just have pots of money that they are able to provide for people. The reason why there are debates about this in society is because when the government does provide welfare, that welfare is paid for by taxpayers. And taxpayers are people who work and have a proportion of their income dependent on how much they earn taken from them every month. Let's have a look at the first side of our argument, and we are looking at the Marxist theory. Marxists would argue that it is the responsibility of the government in a capitalist society to help provide financially for the poorest in society, and that this does not currently go far enough in protecting the poorest. This is because poverty is not the fault of the individual in society, but ultimately results from class-based inequalities, according to Marxists, due to exploitation from capitalism. In their view, the ruling class own the means of production, and this leaves the working class with only their labour to sell, leaving people to struggle to afford material goods in society. Capitalism also relies on employment in order to keep workers in line and wages down, which leaves some people in society completely unable to support themselves. Therefore, the person experiencing poverty is helpless in trying to address it themselves, and governments are responsible for helping people until capitalism is abolished. However, Traditional Marxists can be accused of being outdated in their views, as there has been an extensive welfare system created since World War II, which means many people are supported when they experience poverty. So, Marxists are always going to have capitalism, the economic base in society, at the forefront of their mind when they are thinking about any topic in sociology. They are a structural theorist that were writing predominantly during the Industrial Revolution, where there was mass poverty within the UK. So Karl Marx, for example, could see lots of factory owners making lots of money in the UK at the expense of poor working class people who were unable to lift themselves out of a poverty trap. Therefore, for Marxists who take a traditional view, it is not the fault of the working class that they are in poverty, because people have only their labour to sell within a capitalist society which is exploitative. Furthermore, Marxists argue that in a capitalist society we have what is known as a reserve army of labour, i.e. we need unemployed people. Factory owners and bosses need to be able to tell people that if they don't keep in line, if they don't do what they are told, then they will be replaced immediately by a new, more obedient worker. And this therefore stops people complaining about their wages and means people might be living in poverty, despite the fact they are contributing through work. Therefore, in an ideal situation for Marxists, the government would have lots of lovely welfare policy to ensure that no one is homeless and to ensure that no one experiences levels of extreme or absolute poverty. However, we did mention there the fact that Marx was referring to industrialised Britain, and therefore taking this traditional Marxist view is very outdated. Governments do now protect the poorest in society through a welfare state. We do have initiatives such as universal credit, we do have council housing to provide for people, and therefore Marxists in a traditional sense ignore the way that society has helped poor people. We could, as a structural theory, also accuse Marxists of focusing too much on the impact of capitalism on individuals and not enough on the individual's responsibility to find a job and to ensure that they are not experiencing poverty. Here we could argue that Marxists are taking an overly deterministic view, and they are basically regarding the working class and the poorest in society as having a victim status. Let's now take a look at the other side of the argument, which is going to take a very, very opposing view to this Marxist ideology. However, the New Right staunchly disagree with this approach. They argue that it is never the responsibility of the government to provide financially for members of society. This is because they believe all people in society should take an individual responsibility, ideally within a nuclear family structure to support themselves. They also believe that when the government does provide extensive welfare benefits, this has a detrimental effect on wider society, creating an underclass and culture of dependency, whereby people are no longer able to work and this value is passed down to other generations. However, New Right sociologists are criticised for failing to understand other factors outside of personal responsibility, such as ethnicity and gender, that may make people more susceptible to experiencing poverty. So we go straight into our other theoretical perspective, the New Right. Just to give you some more background information to this group, they are associated with the right wing, were very popular within the 1980s in the UK and have had a lot of impact on social policy. You should be aware of them from the education side of the course, where we discuss their views about marketisation. Here they are arguing that, again, we need to create a society where the individual is left alone by the government in order to support themselves. You might also remember the New Right when it comes to families and households, as they really advocate the use of a nuclear family to ensure that people never fall into poverty. In the New Right's view, if you have a strong nuclear family, you have a female to carry out the expressive role and a male to support that female and his family through economic responsibility, i.e. that male has a duty to provide for his family. And to bring across some of that synoptic knowledge to this point, that is why the New Right are so against one-parent families or lone parent families, as they argue those types of families are more likely to fall into a poverty trap because they lack a strong male breadwinner role, and therefore those families will start to rely on welfare. And if you are ever discussing the new right in the exam, I would really argue that you need to get in a couple of key concepts such as an underclass and a culture of dependency. With regards to underclass, this is an idea associated with Charles Murray, who basically suggested that there was a new class in modern Britain and USA society that were underneath the working class. They are a class that do not work, that rely on the welfare state, and often encourage lone parenthood. And he argues that this class get caught in a culture of dependency, i.e. they pass these norms and values down to generation. And therefore, their children will become work shy and their grandchildren will become work shy. Clearly then, in this view, it absolutely is vital that the government is not responsible for financially supporting the poorest in society, because according to the New Right and Charles Murray, this just creates more problems. We then criticise this view, and there are certainly lots of ways we could criticise that view. Here we go with the argument that actually Charles Murray and the New Right fail to understand factors that may cause people to become poor that are totally out of their control. We could also argue that the New Right tend to lump lone parent families in particular into this view of an underclass, whereas actually there are plenty of single parent families where that single parent works incredibly hard to provide for their children. Moving on. In conclusion, it is clearly the responsibility of the government and all of society to help the most vulnerable in society who may be unable to provide for themselves. So we take that sociological view that actually we are responsible in society as a group together to help people who might find it more difficult to help themselves.
Ouch! This is when some videos I'll explain scratches.